Hello, I'm Suzanne James for the Green Left Show. Thank you for joining us. We'd like to acknowledge that we are filming on stolen First Nations land, always has been, always will be, and we pay our respects to elders, past and present. Also, if you like our work, please click like and subscribe and become a supporter from as little as $5 a month. Following a 2-year investigation, a UN Commission of Inquiry dropped a report last week has confirmed what we've been saying for some time, that Israel is indeed committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. The report cites Israel's direct targeting of civilians and the blocking of aid as a deliberate strategy to, quote, kill as many Palestinians as possible. It also says that Israel is committing the crime against humanity of extermination. To talk to us about that and Australia's subsequent statement at the UN in New York recognising Palestine as a state after decades refusing to do so, we are very pleased to be joined today by Professor Chris Sidoti. Chris Sidoti is a member of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, a former Human Rights Commissioner, a lawyer and an internationally recognised expert on human rights law. He very kindly joins us now from Sydney. Professor Sidoti, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's nice to join you.
Let's start with the report itself, which confirms that Israel is committing genocide in a deliberate attempt to exterminate the Palestinian people, and that there is no military necessity behind their actions, which Israel are still claiming are self-defence. You said recently on ABC about the report, and I quote, "We are providing the most authoritative assessment yet on the situation, and the most authoritative until the court rules." You then went on to say that the Australian government and others were obliged to act now rather than wait for that final ruling from the International Court of Justice. Tell us, if you will, Chris, what is it that makes this report in particular so authoritative, and how should Australia act now in light of its findings?
The authority of the report lies both in the authority of the Commission itself, but also of the nature of the report. Our Commission was established 4 years ago, 2 years before the events of 7 October 2023, by a resolution of the United Nations Human Rights Council. The Council was having an emergency meeting in response to the escalation of violence in Gaza that occurred in May 2021. That was one of a series of escalations in violence, a series of episodes in a 100-year war dealing with the land of Palestine, using the name of the old British mandate for the territory. The Human Rights Council established our commission and gave us a mandate to investigate human rights, humanitarian law, and international criminal law issues arising in the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole, and also in Israel. Having been so charged, we set about the job of examining those issues. Since 7 October 2023, our focus has been very much on what has occurred in Gaza. We have produced now 8 reports on that issue, releasing them over the last 15 months. Our approach has been to look at the events in Gaza part by part, examining, for example, the destruction of the healthcare system, the destruction of the education system, the destruction of cultural property, so mosques, churches, museums, libraries, archaeological sites. We've looked at sex and gender-based violence. We've examined the nature of the Israeli military operation and the killing and injury that has resulted directly from that. We've examined land and the total destruction of housing. So each of those issues has been examined in turn in our reports, commencing in June 2024. Having done that, having looked at the situation on a piece-by-piece basis, we have been able to bring all of our work together in this more comprehensive examination of the question of genocide. And genocide requires a comprehensive examination. It can't just be looked at in terms of 1 or 2 or more isolated incidents. It needs to examine the whole picture. And for us, that involves relying upon our own investigation work and our own findings and conclusions. We haven't relied on the work of others. We haven't relied on second-hand reports. but on eyewitnesses, on an enormous quantity of digital evidence, satellite imagery, and so forth in coming to our conclusions. And so it's because of the authority of the Commission and the nature of the report itself, our methodology of conducting our own investigations and making our own findings, that gives this report the authority that it has. The International Court of Justice, of course, is a higher authority than we are. It's a court. We're not. We're a legal body, but not a court. But the International Court of Justice won't decide this issue for another 2 or perhaps 3 years. Until then, the report that we have produced is the most authoritative to come from the United Nations system.
So when you say Australia and other countries should act immediately, what would you like to see them do immediately?
There are a number of steps that must be taken under Australia's legal obligation to act to prevent genocide. I know that the Australian government and others are saying we leave it to the court to decide the issue of genocide. Well, the first thing is I don't think they can leave it till the court. They can't wait another 2 or 3 years. It will be too late. But in any event, the court itself in January last year, January 2024, indicated that there was a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza. And that finding was sufficient to trigger Australia's obligations under the Genocide Convention to act to prevent genocide. That requires us to take specific steps right across the spectrum of the relationship between Australia and Israel. In another decision in July last year, the International Court of Justice referred to the areas in which individual states should act. It talks about diplomatic, political, economic, military, cultural areas. And we can take steps in each of those areas. The criteria are the positive obligation to prevent genocide and the secondary obligation, a negative obligation, not to take any steps at all that in any way aid or assist Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine or its illegal settlements within Palestine. So that means a prohibition on the arms trade. And that's a two-way prohibition. It deals with not just the provision of actual weapons, but also components of weapons, materials that can be used in weapons, trade in weapons, and importantly, trade in surveillance technology. Israel has some of the best surveillance technology in the world, and it uses that technology against Palestinians. When other countries like Australia purchase information technology, surveillance technology from Israel, we are subsidizing their development, their research and development on technology, producing better technology that can be used against Palestinians. So that's an example of how an examination of the arms trade requires a two sides approach, both purchasing and providing. But it goes beyond arms. It goes to anything that can in any way assist the Israeli war effort. And so trade. Another example, we have a trade office and a defense office operating in Jerusalem. We should be closing that. We should not be cooperating with the Israeli military, and we should not be promoting trade with Israel. So there are a number of very specific steps that we can take.
Australia and other Western countries, since that report was made public, have gathered in New York for the next United Nations General Assembly. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese formally told that UN meeting that Australia now recognises Palestine as a state. That makes 157 of the 193 UN member states that have now done so. Why do you think Labor has chosen now to recognise Palestine when Gaza is already in ruins and the West Bank is being destroyed by illegal occupations? Why now?
I guess it's because the situation is so bad that the government has felt compelled to act. It's been ALP policy for a long time, several years now, that the recognition of the state of Palestine should be a priority for a Labor government. So it's been on the books, on the policy books for a long time. I think that the Australian government initially was slow to act upon that policy. But the situation now is so bad, so obviously totally unacceptable, that some action is necessary. And Australia has been encouraged to take this action by the significant number of other like-minded states that are taking the same steps. So states we have a traditional relationship with, like the United Kingdom and Canada, but also many other European states, led by France, but also Belgium, Portugal, Malta. So we are acting now with significant company of Western states with which we have a great deal in common. I think the step of recognition should have occurred years ago, but the fact that it's occurring now can only be described as a good step.
Better late than never. Given Israel would seem to have no intention of ever allowing a two-state solution to happen, and they've all but destroyed Gaza already, do you have any real hope that a two-state solution can still be reached?
I do, if for no other reason than there is no alternative. The simple fact, looking at history, is that at some point the fighting will stop. At some point, the killing will stop. At some point, there will be no alternative but to negotiate a basis for peace. And the only basis for peace to begin with is the establishment of two states. That may or may not be the long-term resolution. That's up to the people of Israel and the people of Palestine to resolve between themselves. But as a starting point, there is no alternative but two states, and it's going to happen. The only question I have, the only concern I have, is when. And that means how many more people must be slaughtered before the inevitable process of peace is seriously undertaken.
Australia is yet to support the findings of the report or agree publicly with the UN that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. In the meantime, they continue, as you pointed out, arming Israel through its two-way defence trade. They're refusing to take more Palestinian refugees or issue permanent visas. And they're also continuing to refuse to help aid flotillas get into Gaza. So what are Australia's obligations under international law into relation to defence, aid and refugees? And how are we currently in breach of those obligations?
It's certainly true. The Australian government at this stage is saying that it is not prepared to recognise that what is occurring in Gaza constitutes genocide. But delaying that decision does not absolve us of immediate, urgent international legal obligations. And those obligations are founded in two separate areas of international law. The first is the obligation to prevent genocide. As I've indicated, the International Court of Justice has already referred to the risk of genocide, and that automatically triggers an obligation on Australia to act to prevent. The second area of international law is international humanitarian law, or the law of war, expressed in the Geneva Conventions. And we have obligations under the four Geneva Conventions to act to ensure that other states are complying with the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law. So the obligations are there. The only question is not the definition of genocide, but what we are going to do to fulfill the obligations we have. I've referred to some of those steps in relation to arms trade, certainly in relation to diplomatic representation through the Defence and Trade Office. We need to be looking at whether any Australian citizens or others entering Australia have served in the Israeli Defence Forces over the last 2 years, and in particular have served in Gaza. And if they have, they need to be investigated. If there is evidence that they have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide, they should be prosecuted and an Australian court determine their guilt or innocence. So that obligation is there. We really need to extend the existing prohibition in Australian law against Australians fighting alongside international or foreign armed groups to include a prohibition of Australians fighting in international armies or other forms of official militaries as well. This kind of international mercenary activity, or even activity that is not mercenary but based on another loyalty, should no longer be acceptable by the Australian government. So there are specific steps that we should take. They are some of them. We need, however, a much broader review. I had expected, naively it seems, last July, when the International Court of Justice produced its advisory opinion that found that the continued occupation and settlement were unlawful, I would have expected that Australia, like other states, undertook a comprehensive review of all aspects of its relationship with the State of Israel and identified those aspects that in any way aid and assist the continuation of Israel's unlawful activities. We didn't do that. It still needs to be done. A public report should be published, and areas of the relationship that we identify as aiding or assisting Israel's unlawful activities should be terminated.
Perhaps because so many Western leaderships have failed to act in accordance with basic international law during this conflict, grassroots support for the Palestinian people and for sanctions against Israel on a number of fronts have continued to grow globally and in Australia, and Israel is looking increasingly isolated. The movement is definitely calling for an end to the two-way arms trade, yet Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Defence Minister Richard Marles still continue to insist there isn't one. Given Australia has signed new contracts with Elbit Systems and with our long convoluted supply line through major corporations such as Lockheed Martin, for example, for the F-35 components, it seems highly unlikely they wouldn't end up in weapons being used in Gaza. So please tell us, Chris, what does international law say about Australia's complex defence contracting and supply chains in relation to their obligations to ensure weapons are not being used in a genocide?
There is two-way trade going on, and it needs to be broadly examined. The problem in Australia's practice at the moment is that we have rightly prohibited the provision of arms to Israel, but that prohibition seems to be restricted only to an actual weapon and not to components and materials and technology. And that's a very serious failure. It's a defect in the prohibition of the arms trade itself. There are component parts that we are making for the F-35 fighter bombers, and we know that the F-35s are being used in Gaza. We justify the provision of components because it's an international system, and we may provide them through a third state like the United States, although there is some evidence that we are providing the components directly. But whether we provide them directly or indirectly, we shouldn't be doing so. We are providing materials that can be used in the production of weapons in Israel. Steel, for example, is used in the production of tanks. I don't know whether Australian steel is being used for that purpose, but I do know that we should be prohibiting any trade in materials that could be used for the purpose of the production of weapons. So our understanding of a prohibition on the arms trade is very narrow, very limited, and is not effective in ensuring that Australia is not contributing to Israel's capacity to wage war. That's the kind of examination that we need to be undertaking, and then acting on the steps, taking the steps that are necessary as a result of that.
Back in 2024, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's arrest, as well as for his defence minister. However, Australia has also so far refused to publicly state equivocally that he would be arrested should he come here. What's your view on that, and what would your legal advice to the government be in relation to how to handle that?
The problem is that Australia's response was equivocal. It didn't remain totally silent, but simply made a general statement of its continuing support for the International Criminal Court. So far as it went, that was good. But we should be matching or implementing that support for the court with a complete endorsement of all actions taken by the court, including the enforcement of warrants. Warrants have been issued, as you indicate, for Prime Minister Netanyahu and for the then Defence Minister Gallant. Should they come to Australia, we should be prepared to act on the warrants to arrest the two of them and send them to The Hague. I anticipate that the court will be issuing further warrants. Its investigations have been continuing. As those warrants are issued, we should be prepared to act on them.
What do you think and what do you hope will come out of the current United Nations General Assembly in New York? How do you think that's going to pan out?
I hope that the General Assembly will take up the recommendations of the summit that occurred on Monday. This is, again, a fairly convoluted UN process. The summit that occurred on Monday feeds into the General Assembly, but doesn't itself make the General Assembly's decisions. I hope that the General Assembly will take decisive action and, in particular, be very specific about the steps that states should take. It's no longer possible to expect action on this issue or any issue out of the UN Security Council. That's where the leadership should be, and that's where decisive decisions should be taken, instructing states and binding states to take action. But the Security Council's dysfunctional. That's not going to occur. So we should be looking to the General Assembly to make up for the gap in the Security Council's actions, and not merely to pass a resolution stating opinion, but proposing very specific steps that states should take to place pressure on the government of Israel to end the war, to end the killing, and to make peace. That's what I expect the General Assembly has to do.
What do you think causes that dysfunction, Chris?
The dysfunction lies at the heart of the makeup of the Security Council and decisions taken in 1945 when the United Nations was set up. Those who negotiated the UN Charter were very aware of the failures of the League of Nations during the between-war years, and the fact that the great powers between World War I and World War II either were not members of the League of Nations or were not committed to it. And part of their strategy to lock in the great powers was to give 5 of them permanent membership of the Security Council and veto power over all Security Council decisions. And that has meant that one or other of 3 of the 5 will constantly exercise a veto to protect its friends and allies. So we see the United States habitually vetoing resolutions relating to Israel and Palestine, in the same way as Russia and China veto resolutions dealing with Ukraine or Myanmar or a number of other situations. And the net result is that the Security Council is simply not able to do its job. It is, as I say, totally dysfunctional.
The basic governance failure, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a total failure of governance, and therefore we need to recognise that and simply bypass the Security Council. We can no longer expect it to lead. The responsibility therefore falls to the General Assembly in an institutional sense, but also to individual states. We've spoken about the obligations of the Australian government. These are obligations that lie on every state individually, with or without any collective decisions in the United Nations.
Chris Sidoti, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's good talking to you, and good through you to have an opportunity to talk to so many other people.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Professor Chris Sidoti, a member of the UN Commission of Inquiry that released its report last week confirming that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. My name's Suzanne James for Green Left. Thank you for joining us.